Welcome to Keep Hustling, where we are going past the why to get to the how. I'm your host, the always hustling Aaron Gordon, aka NY Risk Advisor, aka Mr. Keep Hustling. In this podcast, we will be diving deep into the professional and personal successes of our guests to find out how they hustled through the most difficult times in their life and their development to achieve the success they've gotten to today. So buckle up for what hopes to be an amazing ride. Let's get to it. Welcome to Keep Hustling with my guest, Dana Ayers. Dana, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
I'm excited to have you. I read your bio, and I tell all of in every episode I lead with or mention that everyone should read the bios. Yours is fascinating. I want to dig into a bunch of it and your hustle and things like that. But I want to start with not something I don't usually start with, but the background. Anyone who's watching the video, your background is a map of the world.
Yeah.
I assume that that's somewhat intentional, not just for this recording, but in general. So can we get some insight on that? And then we'll kind of dig into your background, and maybe it'll get us to your background.
It's actually a pink map of the world. It's blush. I don't know if you can tell.
It's hard to tell that.
Yeah, my office is very girly. It's blush and gold. And honestly, I wish I could say it's intentional for interviews. I really need to have like my book in the background. I need to do the whole thing, and I haven't. This is just literally what's at my back when I'm at my desk every day.
But why did you choose that? What made you choose the map of the world as your backdrop that you see every day when you sit down at your desk?
I love travel. I've had a huge travel bug. I've actually slowed down consciously, which I never thought I would do in the last year because I just got burned out because I was traveling constantly. But yeah, it makes me happy. Adventure and seeing new things makes me happy.
So take us back, the adventure, the military. Oh, by the way, thank you very much for your service.
Oh, my pleasure.
I should have led with that, but on behalf of myself, my family, and probably all of our listeners, really thank you for that. What do we need to know how you got to the ultimate hustler and motivator that you are today? What do you think it was in your upbringing that led to that, and then obviously led to your kind of service, and from there to your current career?
Sure. I mean, I am definitely wired hot. I'm geared high, that's just how I was born. The thing I heard the most when I was little was, why can't you just sit still from my mother?
I hear that. Yeah. I hear that.
So it comes naturally. And then my dad was very entrepreneurial. I didn't even really realize that at the time, but looking back, he was involved in all sorts of things. So I think probably a lot of it comes from him. And then they were just very supportive. So I never, if I wanted to go after a dream, they weren't squashing it. So I think that gave me kind of free rein to go after all sorts of things. And I tried to go after everything that comes to mind ever since.
So I want to unpack two of those things there. And I've mentioned this on episodes in the past, but I think that you actually articulated it perfectly. And that is that a lot of times where we end up in life or how our hustle is inspired, we don't even realize when those seeds were planted. And certainly what I would say is we may realize that as we look back on it, but in the moment, especially parents don't realize the seeds or the foundations or the notions that they're planting within their children. And I think that is something super important when people analyze or try to define their hustle, is realizing that our hustles are made up of a big group of smaller events that happened. And I think it's just incredible that one of the things that you pointed out is, and a lot of parents do this intentionally or unintentionally, the ability that your parents had to just not squash that dream. And I think that that's huge because, again, I don't think that parents would ever intentionally want their children not to succeed or not to chase their dreams. But very often parents and mentors mix their dreams with the dreams of those who they are influencing. And I guess that freedom kind of really led you to where you are today.
Yeah, absolutely. Even at 5 years old, I was like, I want to do dance lessons and I want to do piano. And then I want to play softball and then I want to play basketball. And they supported, this crazy kid that was constantly coming up with new things. So I'm definitely grateful. I agree. Huge.
What track to the military?
Oh, it was not linear. Nothing in my life is nothing in anybody's life is, right? My career path started on a whim because I grew up in small rural towns and I wanted to live in a big city. I had no idea what that meant, but it sounded awesome. And I was watching The West Wing at the time, was the show. And
I am a huge, huge fan. We could go line for line if you want.
yes, huge Aaron Sorkin fan. And I was in college and I didn't know what I wanted to do after college. I was a business major and the only thing I had was go to a city, wear a suit. that's the extent of my plans. And my friend did a semester in DC through our college. I had no interest in political science or government at the time, but I was like, well, DC's a city, right? They wear suits. check. So
restaurants open past 7 p.m.
100%. Yeah. So I was like, well, if this is an opportunity that my college is providing, then I'm going to apply. And it changed my life. And, I had been watching The West Wing. And so I was like, okay, it might be fun. And by divine intervention, because this is nothing that I could have made happen. But the program was half class, half internship. And they happened to have 3 White House internships left. And since I didn't know what I wanted to do, like some people were like, oh, I want to go into this justice, Department of Justice, or go on work for a senator. And I was like, whatever you got. And they're like, we've got the White House. And of course, West Wing. I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to say no.
Meanwhile, you saw nothing that looked like anything you saw on the West Wing.
Not nothing, but it's definitely not those fast-paced walk-talk scenes constantly.
So let me ask you actually about that. I want to jump. That's a great comment about the hustle. What is it like that effectively your first job is in the White House?
Yeah. So
what is that like? I assume it's somewhat intimidating. I assuming the amount of security credentialing makes you, question even your own name and date of birth, let alone everything else. But what is it like that when you reflect on your career? Probably, I would say in the middle of it now, it all started in the West Wing. That's like not some random office in Kentucky.
I mean, it set the trajectory for my whole adult life, right? Like it was incredible. I mean, you can't say that it's not, even if you're not into government or politics. It at the time, at least, it was seen as the leader of the free world that you're working for, directly for, and just the perks that come along with it. We could go to the South Lawn at times and watch a foreign dignitary land and do a little celebration for him, or we'd go to the White House mess and have, M&Ms with the presidential seal on. There's a lot of fun perks. And I started as an intern, but then I ended up getting a full-time job. So I ended up being a political appointee in the Bush administration for about 5 years total.
Crazy years. So that was I guess it was post 9/11?
9/11 was my second day.
Wow. We just got the rest of the episode. Yeah. Okay. I'm a New York born and bred kid. I was actually, this episode is being recorded the week after 9/11, 2024. I remember it vividly. But if you don't mind, tell us about that and what it was like and how it changed your view of A, working in the White House, what you thought you were going to be doing, and B, your future in government work and U.S. service. I mean,
it's so heavy, right? Like it's hard to, it's hard to put into words, but one thing, so it was obviously, it changed our world overnight as far as like security wise, because I'm kid you not. So we were in 98% of the White House staff is in what's called the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. It's this giant Gothic building that's on the White House compound, but it's not in the residence, because the residence is fairly small in comparison. So the West Wing's in the residence, the East Wing's in the residence, and then where they live, that's what's there. And then a lot of other things are in the old exec. And I just remember we were watching the news say that the White House was being evacuated. And we're like, really? Because we're still here. And I stepped out of our office and I looked down this long hallway and a Secret Service and bomb gear was like, what are you doing? This is real, run. That was our alarm system. Like we had no alarms going out. We had nothing. It was just like everyone was trying to figure out what was going after the second plane, right? Then everybody was like, okay, this is something. So I leaned back into my office.
The president wasn't there.
What?
Correct? I think the president was in
he was in Florida. Right? Yeah, he was in Florida. But the vice president was there in the West Wing. And, yeah, so I lean back in my office and I'm like, scared. This is my second day. And like, I think we're supposed
What
to
did I
leave.
do?
Like, yeah,
But how did that shape you? I mean, you didn't run from it. So how did that,
no.
I assume as much as everyone else's world changed, being right in the center of what happened, how did it happen, what's the reaction, the president's world famous address, things like that. What was it like being there, and how does that impact you even until today?
Yeah. So we ended up walking to a coworker's house to hole up the rest of that day because you couldn't, you couldn't get on. There was gridlock and there was all the kinds of rumors that there was a fire on the metro. There was another plane headed to the Capitol. So we stayed with her most of the rest of that day, but then most of the staff went back to work the next day. I mean, there were some people that never came back, but most of us did. And the president, I believe it was the following Monday, himself walked around to our offices and thanked people for coming back. And that solidified my love for him in a way, because I'm like, that's a good leader, right? Like, he didn't have to do that, but he knew we didn't have to do that either. And just watching his leadership during that time, and like him, with the bullhorn in New York, and like, I personally, I mean, I'm biased. We still have reunions with him to this day. So it gelled the staff and it gelled my love for him. So I apologize if if anyone disagrees.
That's not, you know what? I think that someone could say that the days and weeks following that were outside of politics. Mm-hmm. Maybe it was a time of bliss that we lived in, but I remember living in New York, even, not the most Republican conservative state in the Republic, but just that feeling. And I can't imagine that you were prepared for that. And it was 2 days into the job. Yet, I would say, and this is a lot about what Keep Hustling is and what defines our hustle and impacts our hustle, is that moment that you didn't expect, that moment that you might have been overwhelmed. Looking back at it now, 20-something years later, 23 and a few days to be exact, probably had an endless, everlasting impact on you and how your career has been for the last 23 years, even, the 18 or 19 years since the White House. So,
yeah.
Did you ever think about that?
Oh, definitely. Because indirectly, that's also how I ended up serving in the military. Because, when 9/11 happened, everybody everybody wanted to do some kind of public service. I was already in public service at the time with the Bush administration, but I met a guy at my church who we volunteered at the Pentagon because they were doing cleanup and they were doing forensics. And so we would send volunteers to serve people overnight that were working the scene. And so we met that way. Long story short, he joined the Army out of, patriotism. And I followed his journey for years. And I was jealous because I was like seeing all these amazing traits in him and his friends. They took care of each other and they were very capable. Like they knew how to change tires and stuff that I didn't know how to do. And I, would stay in touch with him when he got deployed to Iraq. And anyway, long story, in the back of my mind, I was like, I wish I had served, but I'd already talked myself out of it. I was already in my 20s. I was like, oh, I wish I had served. And then in my 30s, I met a guy who was also working in the Bush administration. We were at an event together. And I was like, oh, what are you up to now? And he's like, well, I joined the Navy. And I'm like, what do you mean you joined the Navy? We're 30.
We're too old
for that. But he told me about this program it's called Direct Commission. And it's a system where the military will potentially take you as an officer if you have a specific skill set that they need. And I didn't know that existed. So it was an alternate route. I could still weasel my way in and I did it. And that's when but it started way back with the patriotism around 9/11.
What was different about joining the military versus joining the Bush administration? Meaning, what did you feel? What led you to drive to do that? And you could have stayed in public service and gotten that rewarding political drive from somewhere else, but yet you decided to go to the military at that point.
I just felt like I would regret it if I didn't. And I found myself for years saying things like, oh, I've considered joining the military, and you get a reward from that. Like people are like, oh, you're amazing that you considered something, like we don't realize this, but a lot of times we say stuff and we feel we get like a fake reward. We're not really doing it. And so after a while, I was like, I'm getting people's admiration for something I didn't do. And I'm going to regret if I don't. Like I was volunteering for veteran service organizations just to be near that community. I was drawn to that community, and I was like, I'm going to regret if I can't put the uniform on myself. And I'm so grateful I did. Like I've had amazing experiences and I've been a reservist the entire time. I went straight into the reserves. I went straight in as an officer, which is not normal, or I'd say that's not the typical path, but I've gotten to deploy twice. I went to combat zones. I went to Afghanistan. I went with special forces. Like it's been incredible.
I didn't even know you were in the combat zones. That's an automatic question. How does being there impact? Meaning, people can talk about it. People can talk about joining the military, not joining the military, whether they can or they're cut out for it. I imagine that the first time you get off, presumably a non-luxurious aircraft in a combat zone, that's a real thing. And that requires a level of hustle that many of us probably have or probably don't know how to tap into. So what was that like?
Yeah.
First arrived in the crazy places.
I think some of us are more wired to run towards danger than to run away. I do think that's a specific wiring in some people, and I think I have a little bit of that. So I was more excited than anything, but I will say it totally depends on your job in the military, right? Like results may vary. Like I wasn't the Army infantry that was being shot at. I knew I was in system, almost like bubbles, where you travel.
Relatively, but you still weren't sitting at home in New York or DC or wherever else. You're still in a combat zone. You still probably hear or see that doesn't require being in the trenches, right? So
True.
You made that conscious decision to put yourself in that position, as you said, well after most people would in their life. And I guess it was that call to service, which was the hustle bug you had at that moment.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I'm so grateful for like the Afghans on my team over there that I got to meet. And now a lot of them live in the US. Like a lot of them, thank the Lord, almost my entire team made it out when everything was going down. And America was leaving. And that has been one of the most meaningful things I've ever been a part of, was like trying to check on them and make sure that they were safe and trying to help their families. I mean, that means you can't put that into words, how much that meaningful and purposeful,
It's interesting because a lot of what I've learned from this podcast is that type of camaraderie and partnership, personally and professionally, is super important for people. Yet the really impactful relationships, right? They say there's no atheist in a foxhole. There's also probably no one who wants to be alone in a foxhole. In that is probably so formative and impactful and deep and emotional in terms of a relationship, yet it's impossible to replicate or to create in a vacuum. So it's just interesting how a lot of times the things that inspire us and inspire our hustle are the things that come with quote unquote other strings attached, in that you have to be in a war zone to be able to create that connection. So is it worth it to have that ancillary pressure or risk or things like that to form you into into the most robust and best person that you can be? So I just find it interesting that it's those relationships that everyone wants, yet sometimes the things that are attached to it can make it difficult to achieve.
I agree, but I'm assuming, I've never been part of a startup, but I'm assuming there's a similar, not to that degree, not to that intensity, but I'm assuming there's a similar bonding, trauma bonding.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Pressure.
Yeah. Pressure. And pressure.
The rice
and
cooks
like
quicker in the pressure cooker, right? So
nobody else understands what you guys went through but you. So I think you can create I think you can have that to a degree without having to go to a war zone. But my career path just happens to have a lot of national level chaos, because I was also in part of the Bush administration. When I left the White House, I was at the White House like 2.5 years total. I went to the Department of Homeland Security when it was being born, like they were creating it. And I ended up settling into FEMA, and I was there during Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah.
So
for those of us insurance people out there, wow. So basically wherever you go, chaos follows. I was going to ask what you do now or how that impacted your career now, but I'm not sure anyone wants to know because they'll just immediately run the other way.
There's always a point in the interview when someone realizes that, and you can see
Yeah, but you know what? That's amazing. And I think that, again, the ability to grab that by the horns and say, this is what I'm going to do. And this is what I'm made for. And by the way, another common topic that I mentioned already in this podcast is that past experiences lead us to gain confidence in our future abilities. And I assume that had you been dropped in that FEMA situation with Katrina, it would have been far more overwhelming and daunting had you not been through the previous life experiences and those quote unquote traumatic or difficult moments or events. That's where the impact is. It's not sitting in not that classrooms are not important. I don't want to get into that, but meaning it's not specifically in the classroom or in the times that you predict and you're modeling about your career and your life. It's those outer fringe moments that probably have the greatest impact.
100%. And I do think that like confidence is like a mound and it just keeps growing. And the more, which is why people shouldn't be afraid of failure, right? Because you're building an immunity to failure, then you can face bigger challenges because you're like, oh, I've already lived through that. I can do that. And, or you're building your confidence. You're like, oh, I can live through that because I've already dealt with this. And I think that, like, I think you, at least for me, I keep wanting more because I keep getting more confident in my ability to adjust. You know, even if something goes awry, I'm like, well, I know myself and I feel like I'm going to figure it out. And that's a beautiful gift, right?
By the way, you have proof that you've done it in the past. So therefore, it's easier to lean on that.
Yeah. So when I joined the military, it was less scary because I had already felt like a leader in my civilian life at multiple times.
Sure. So what was it? So what did you do after that? Where you are today, how was that impacted by these previous experiences? And how did that lead to your incredible hustle now and your ability to push people forward and motivate them?
So I think one of my big fears in life is being bored. So I keep adding other jobs to my resume. So it was, the day job and then the reserves. And then I wrote a book and did like a book tour and started speaking. And I think it's because I had those crazy experiences that every time I see someone and they're like, oh, I wish I could do this, I'm like, yes, you can. Why can't you? I just want to shake people. And so I think that's what draws me to, encouraging audiences, because I feel like I am in a fairly unique position based on my background, my experiences, where I can be like, no, you can. I've done this, and this. I had no business being there. And there's alternate routes. There's always a way to get there if you want it.
Isn't it amazing how people sell themselves short all the time?
All the time.
Like, not at how difficult it'll be, not that they'll guarantee we'll get to that place, but more that so many people don't even try.
100%.
And lose out because they don't even try when they could get there. Obviously, there could always be a stumbling block. There could always be that thing that is unpredictable that happens that stalls a person's career or stops it or doesn't help them or doesn't let them achieve their goals. But it's amazing because when you look back at your career, you could say that the second day in the White House, one of the craziest things that ever happened, and you got through it. The administration at that time got through it. The country got through it, and therefore now, nothing is going to shake us as much as 9/11 did. I sure hope not.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So being in that you were in the trenches there, how many people can say, "Hey, where was I then, or where was I at Katrina, or I put that all back together, and I can achieve anything." So I can write a book if I want. You can show that people told you not to write a book, and you did. So it's an incredible story, and I think that what's most intriguing about your story is the part that there's no one hustle moment. You put them all together and you say, I read your biography. I'm like, wow. And I didn't even know about the 9/11 thing. So I was like, wow, like this person has achieved a lot. And yet, and I mean this as a compliment, nothing nuclear or out of the ordinary, crazy out of the ordinary. You know what I mean? It's just having a dream, following that dream, or a whim. And then the whim helps create the dream. And then the dream and following that dream and keep pushing that forward to eventually reach the top. as opposed to stopping in the middle or having to have something, insane happen to achieve that.
100%. Yeah. I wasn't and I wasn't politically connected. I didn't go, I wasn't super rich. I didn't go to an Ivy League school. And so I ended up around people like that in the White House. And I had to be like, well, guess what? We're in the same place. So I'm not going to.
Yeah. But would you change anything about your experiences?
No, absolutely not. I feel just incredibly grateful. I feel like Forrest Gump, like I accidentally ended up in these places, and I've been in proximity to great power. I am not great power, and I don't want to be. I think that's a lot of pressure. But no, don't give me the coats. But having a front row seat to it over and over again, it also teaches you about humans, right? Like everybody in, special operations command centers to the West Wing to corporate boardrooms, somebody's faking it at some point. Someone doesn't know what they're doing.
More people than you think.
Yeah, exactly. So again, people talk themselves out of it because we just assume that there's people that know what they're doing. They just got there and you didn't, but they don't necessarily have more brains or skills or, resources than you do.
I love it. Dana, I can talk to you all day. You got so many good stories. Maybe we'll have you back. We end every episode by asking our guests to leave us with their favorite motivational and inspirational quote. I'm sure you've been I know you've been to a lot of places, a lot of interesting places, heard from a lot of interesting people. So I can't wait to hear the message that you share with us, and to thank you again, Dana Ayers, for joining us on the Keep Hustling podcast, inspiring me, inspiring others. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say again, thank you for your service, both in the White House and in the military, and for all of us.
Thank you so much. This was so fun. So there's a ton of quotes that I love, but this one always hits me. It's Howard Thurman, who was an advisor to Martin Luther King Jr. And it's, don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive and go do that. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive.
I love that. And that is Keep Hustling. If the world was filled with more people that were alive, then we'd have more hustlers and we'd have a better place. Dana, thank you again.
Thank you.
This has been another episode of Keep Hustling. Remember, do well by doing good. And of course, always keep hustling.
All right, hustlers, that brings us to the end of another fantastic episode. Thank you for listening. The listeners are the most important part of this show. If you like what you heard, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Your feedback means the world to us and helps us reach more listeners. Plus, be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you never miss an episode. We have some amazing guests and topics lined up for you, and we don't want you to miss out. And finally, if you have any suggestions, comments, or even just want to say hello, please feel free to reach out to us on all social media platforms. We are Keep Hustling Pod on Instagram, X, Facebook, and LinkedIn. We would love to hear from you to continue the conversation. Thanks again for tuning in and supporting our podcast. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. Until next time, stay curious, stay hungry, and keep hustling.